Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 13th, 2010, and my guest today is the great Mike Munger of Duke University. Mike, welcome back to EconTalk.
The great Mike Munger. It's a pleasure to be on EconTalk again, Russ.
I meant to say the great Duke University, and it may really reference their basketball team, but
there's still smoking ruins of what used to be wooden benches here on campus.
There's nothing like youth and its exuberance. What I want to do today, Mike, is pick your brain about something I've started to think about, and I think you'll help me think about it, or possibly get me more confused. But I'm pretty confident you'll help me. I was talking to one of my students, Michelle McAdoo, and she's working on a project related to profits and nonprofits and their relative performance. And I was trying to help her with the project, and I realized I didn't really understand the distinction. Slightly awkward for the when the professor's confused. And what I want to do is talk to you about some of my confusion and what I've thought about since then. And I want to start by ignoring the legal distinction between profit and nonprofit. Obviously, there are things that are classified literally as for-profit and literally as nonprofits in our world. But I really want to talk about, when I talk about profit versus nonprofit, I really want to talk about two different business models. So the first business model uses money to motivate people. It's the for-profit. The business tries to make as much money as possible for its investors and its owners. It charges as much as it can, subject to the competition, and pays as little as possible for its resources, its employees, its raw materials, again, subject to the competition. When you describe it that way, charge as much as possible, pay as little as possible, it doesn't sound very attractive. But the key, of course, is subject to the competition, and we argue as economists often, I do very often, that competition brings out the best in businesses and forces them to serve the customer and treat their employees well. Now, this doesn't rule out pride or other non-monetary benefits that might accrue to either the owners for providing a great service or the employees for working for a great company. So we're not saying that money is the only thing that motivates people, but it is the organizing principle of the business, and that's what most businesses in America look like. Now, the second business model uses something else to motivate performance and people within the organization. The product or the service is going to be given away without charge. So the organization is going to make none of its money, none of its costs are going to be covered by the customer paying for it. It's going to be given away free to the customer. The resource costs of providing the product are either covered by volunteers who work for a whole variety of motivations, but nothing to do with money, or it could be covered by donations, by philanthropy, by foundations, by donors, by individuals who care about the activity for its own sake. So I want to start with a ridiculous question, which is, which model works better? The for-profit or the non-profit model in those two business models? Which works better? So what do you think of that?
I think that the first thing I would do in response to your question is ask another question. And that is, aren't you really leaving something out by posing that as the two alternatives? When you describe nonprofits the way you did, and it's an accurate description, if you look at Section 501 of the IRS code, the main justification for having nonprofits is to provide a social service or to solve some of society's problems. So is it really that nonprofits are an alternative to for-profit corporations, or are nonprofits an alternative to government? Do nonprofits do things that governments might actually do? Because not only do nonprofits, as you described them, not charge anything for their service, they actually have negative charges in the case of giving out charitable donations or giving money to the homeless. They're providing these services as an alternative to government. So my question to you is, are nonprofits, as you're thinking of them, are they really an alternative business model to for-profits, or are they an alternative business model to government? And with that, how are we going to divide up? Suppose we're doing a Venn diagram. What activities would we want these three different ways of organizing human activity to specialize in, or do we just stand back and see what happens, kind of emerging naturally? There are some things for-profits are going to do well. We haven't talked about that yet, but which ones are those, and which ones are nonprofits going to do well, and what things are we going to have government do?
Well, that's the way I used to think about it, and I think your point about government's the right one, in that there's at least three business models. I'm going to add a fourth in a little bit. Business is the wrong word. Three organizational models for taking care of some social problem or challenge. One is the pure profit model that we see around us when we look at McDonald's or Macy's or all kinds of organizations in our so-called capitalist system. Then we have a whole bunch of organizations that give their product away and fund it through either donations or volunteers. We have coercion through taxation, and we take that money and through the political process allocate it to various things. But of course, some of those are not necessarily certain. You can already see some overlap because some of the things government spends its money on are not things that, quote, wouldn't be provided otherwise, which is, I think, what most people think of it as, but it's not true. But I'm going to challenge you about those three distinctions because I think in a minute I'm going to pose the hybrid model, which is, you described it as, well, we should see which ones specialize in which activities. I'm going to argue that there are a lot of opportunities for overlap where we can see both models coexisting, the profit and the nonprofit model. And that surprises me, and I'll get your thoughts on it. Before I do that, I want to talk about just the basic motivational question. And to think about it, I think of what Walter Williams likes to say, and I think when I interviewed him a while back, I probably brought it up, which is that if you want to get potatoes to New York City, if you're in a restaurant in New York City and you want potatoes available on the menu and you never want to worry about them not showing up or not being available, and you know that somebody in Idaho has to get up really early through some unpleasant weather conditions to make sure the potatoes are getting grown correctly and getting them out of the field and then into the trucks and or the trains. Do you want them to be motivated out of love for the people of New York or out of the profit that the potato maker can get?
I want them to be motivated out of love. And besides, the self-interested person is going to charge more because they're charging profits, right?
That's right. So how come?
There's two problems. One is it's the wrong motivation. Love will get me better potatoes.
You'd think.
And second, it's all these profits. We don't have to pay profits.
Yeah, it's expensive.
So it's worse potatoes and more expensive.
But it doesn't work that way. And so why is it? So that's one extreme. Most of us, most economists, and even most non-economists, I think, would understand that the profit motive has to play a role to get that person up early in the morning. The example I've used in an essay, which always helps me think about this, is you're on your way to the airport. You've got a 6 a.m. flight, and so you've got to get there at 4:30. And you ask, you're telling a colleague about this, or maybe your brother, a sibling, and you say, I gotta leave at 4:30. I need a ride to the airport. So the sibling or the colleague says, I could take it. It's kind of early, but you don't have to call a cab. I'll take you.
Because they love you.
They love you, and you know that. Or they like you. They might not love you. As even a sibling or a colleague may struggle to love you, but I'm speaking of you. One. But I think a lot of people would say, I like that cab driver showing up at 4:30 because they don't want to lose their job. There's a lot more at stake. I'll forgive my brother if he messes up and sleeps through his alarm clock. But and my brother actually is an exception. My brother is unbelievably reliable, and I wouldn't lose any sleep over him showing up. But I think a lot of folks have brothers that kind of say, maybe I'll just call a cab. So in a lot of situations, we understand the power of monetary incentives. Not just all incentives matter, but monetary incentives in that setting are very powerful. And yet I can think of lots of cases where love triumphs and maybe does a better job. And I want to ask let's. Do you want to comment on that at all before I move on?
Well, at least it does a sufficiently good job that hospitals. We observe for-profit hospitals.
That's my next example.
And we observe hospitals that are run by charitable organizations. And in a sense, they compete with each other.
They do.
But don't they offer a different service? One is...
Not so sure.
We are going to come in, and they say they do.
They say they do.
You come in, and we're going to charge you a price, and the other is, we're going to give this away because you're indigent.
Well,
isn't the nature of the charging just different?
I don't know. For-profit doctors often do charitable work. I would suspect that there are Idaho farmers who donate some of their potatoes to a food bank.
Even attorneys do pro bono work.
Even attorneys. Shame on you, Mike Munger. Even economists do pro bono work. Let's leave it at that. We often blog for free. But here, and I'm going to come to that actually in a little bit, but I want to stick with the doctor example because that was the hospital example. That was my next example. Let's think about in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, a hospital was a place where poor people went to get medical care who were indigent, who did not, there was no health insurance or it was minimal. Normal folk, non-poor folk, middle class, rich people, the doctor came to your house. The hospital was a degrading and unpleasant place where poor people who had no other alternative chose to go. It was typically, I assume, free or very inexpensive. If it was, certainly wasn't, there was no market pricing there.
Yeah.
And it was funded out of charitable donations, often by a religious organization, sometimes by ethnic groups would have their own, or sometimes occupations, sailors, and others would fund voluntarily medical care for its members as a form of implicit insurance or actual insurance. And in those systems, if you asked where would you rather go, to the hospital or to be treated at home by a doctor for money, I think every person of the day would have said, I would rather go to a doctor and give them money rather than have to go to the hospital where the poor people go because the care there just won't be as good. And yet in today's world, we now have this weird hybrid system. Weird in the sense that it's somewhat puzzling to me. It's not literally weird. Everybody's in it all the time, never thinks twice about it. Where we will have, say, a university hospital, which a lot of people say, that's the one you want to go to. Where in theory, not in fact, of course, but in theory, it's not for profit. Of course, it does generate revenue, but it need not. It could be that a hospital today, and forget all the government complications, which makes this story messy, but a hospital today could be for people. There could be two kinds of hospitals. Hospitals that you go to where you don't have to pay, and the doctors who work there either work out of love, volunteering, meaning that's what I mean by out of love, or their time is paid for just like a hospital. They get a salary, but it's not paid for by the customer. It's paid for by people who want to make sure that poor people have health care. So
I still want to ask if those aren't just different products. It may look a lot the same when you go in, but in one case, it's something that's being provided out of some sort of, it's being financed at least.
Correct.
Out of the selflessness of the donor. The doctor could be donating in kind his or her labor, or could be paid and the donation is from the contributor. Isn't that different from a fee-for-service arrangement where I go in and you're just comparing apples and oranges?
Well, the apples and oranges part I'm comparing is that in this, the way I've constructed the nonprofit example, which I will mention is the EconTalk example. EconTalk is provided at no charge to the listeners.
It's just market price, I would say.
Yeah, that's a possibility. But there are people out there who would presumably pay something. It might be hard to collect it. But a number of Liberty Fund, which is the sponsor of the program, funds a payment to me and the time of the people who also work on the program, the engineer and the webmaster who puts them up on the web, and
the web space,
all the equipment, the server, and all that. The listeners pay nothing. And as a result, there's a disconnect between the provider and the customer that we normally would say in economics is problematic. And I want to talk about some of those issues in a minute. But if we think about a hospital, wouldn't it be better for the poor people served by the hospital to pay something or for the donors to give the money to the poor people rather than to give the money to the hospital and have the customers pay zero. And yet, I think most people would say, well, that's okay. That's what charities do. Charities don't charge, and they raise their money from people who care. And businesses, they do charge because that's better. And as a result, there's more of an incentive in a for-profit business to serve the customer. In a charity, there's always this tension between who's really paying the bills. And you'd think that it's the donors who call the shots, not the poor people.
So in the hospital, if there were particular religious objections to some procedures, we don't need to go into what, let's just suppose there were some objections, the hospital would not provide those because the donor would object to having them provided with the money that he or she had donated, whereas from the perspective of the indigent person who goes there, that's the procedure they actually want to have. And so,
well, and coming back to your government example, we could certainly imagine different charities that handed out money, no questions asked, which is what government does through taxation. Government taxation pretty much hands out money, no questions asked. You could imagine a private charity, though, that would try to find out whether people could be working instead of accepting the money, whether they have an uncle who could pay for some of the things that the charity covers. That's the way charities were run in the early part of the 20th century and before. It was customized, and as you point out, the donors has a lot to say. That it could be they wouldn't let the poor person use it for drink or alcohol or drugs or other things or all kinds of things that the donor might care about.
Because an economist is always going to say, well, what you should do is give vouchers or money to the consumer, not to the producer, because then the consumer is going to decide what he or she wants to spend it on. That model is, interestingly, not going to generate nearly as many donations, either in kind or in money, because the donor has a specific thing. They need health care. They need clean water. They need something that I care about. So it is interesting that it's fascinating, in fact, that the donor is probably at least as concerned about improving the welfare of indigent people in a specific way. This is what I think you lack. Whereas if we just give the money to the indigent person, they'll spend it, but they very well might not spend it on what the donor wants them to spend it on, which is a funny kind of paradox.
Yeah.
Because that presumably really does make the indigent person better off.
Well, I want to,
they're not constrained, but we want to constrain them. What nonprofits do, the reason that we give money to the producer and not to the indigent person is we want to constrain it because the donor thinks this is what they really need.
Well, I'm not so sure I agree with that. I agree that there's a force in that direction. But to come back to one of our earlier podcasts, and this is, and I know something you're thinking about, you can view the charity as a middleman. What the charity does, when I donate to the charity, you're right. Part of the reason I might donate is that I want them to fulfill my goals for a particular kind of help or aid. But the other reason could be is that I'm not very good at finding real poor people, or I don't know how to help them in way. I'm ignorant. I don't know what they really need. So I'm not going to say, I'd like to just give them money. And as a result, I would give to a charity that doesn't give its aid with strings attached, right? It's possible. I agree with you that most people don't feel that way. That's an economist's kind of view of poverty, and I tell the story in my book, The Invisible Heart. It's based on a true story of a friend of mine. She told me that her brother always carries around a V8 juice. So if he sees a beggar on the street or a homeless person, he can give him a V8 juice instead of money so he won't waste it on liquor. And, my first thought is, well, then he won't eat breakfast, and he'll take the money he would have saved on breakfast and use it on liquor. So you're only fooling yourself. My second thought is, well, why would you make him drink a V8 juice? He needs a drink. He wants liquor. I mean, his life's miserable, and you're giving him a V8 juice? It shows a certain disrespect.
Well, if he can get some vodka, he can make a Bloody Mary.
Well, that's true. There's there's a certain compassion there, I suppose. So we've drifted far afield. What I'm interested in honing in on is when I think about the hospitals in America today, of which there are both profits and nonprofits, and we could think about the universities in America today that have a whole range of flavors. We have state-run, highly subsidized. We have private that are somewhat subsidized by all kinds of things, including donations, both of which are nonprofit. But we also have for-profit universities, educational institutions, training schools. Which of those would you want to go to? If you had a bad health problem, God forbid, would you want to go to a place where the doctors were there because their time was funded either out of their love and volunteering interests and the donations of people who cared about people like you, or would you want to go to a place where they would just want to make as much money as possible? And I think as economists, we don't really have a very useful way to think about which of the – I thought we did. But when I think about it some more, I struggle to think about what's really different in those cases that makes that an easy question to answer. I don't think it's so easy.
Is there something lurking in the background that healthcare is just different? I think it's hard to think of another example of an industry where that choice is as real as you rightly make it. I might very well choose a charitable hospital or a nonprofit hospital as being better. Now, some of that would depend just on a kind of local path dependence, where a good hospital in my area for a very long time has had this tradition of being charitably funded rather than being for-profit. And sometimes they convert. They might go one direction or the other. But are there other industries that are like that, or is healthcare just different, where this tradition of commitment to helping and caring about other people is just unique? We don't really see.
Well, that's
not true. We actually see nonprofit charitable farmers co-ops. Here in North Carolina, there are several places. There's in Carborough, the People's Republic of Carborough, here in North Carolina. There's the really, really free market. And in the really, really free market, what people do is they bring stuff that they have, and if you want it, you can take it. But you're supposed to bring, it's not a barter system. You're supposed to bring stuff that you have, and you can get a lot of free food there. And a fair number of people actually do benefit from that. So I think I'm wrong. Let me take that back. I'm not so sure that healthcare is different.
Yeah, I was going to mention food in a different way, because we started with our story of the Idaho farmer who's motivated by money, and that system works really well. And I would argue the for-profit food world has served the poor very well in driving down the price of food to very low levels. But we could imagine a world where poor people got their food not through the marketplace, and again, I'm putting aside food stamps, which is the government third alternative you mentioned earlier. Putting aside food stamps, but if we're worried about people going hungry at night, we could say, instead of saying, well, let's just let people try to make food as cheap as possible, which works incredibly well to the point where we supposedly have an obesity crisis in the United States because food's so cheap. Instead, let's just say, let's raise money to give people free food. A friend of mine, Beavis Schock, used to suggest what we should do for welfare is we should just pile up a bunch of, like your Carborough story, we should just pile up a bunch of food and put it in a big warehouse and let anybody come take it who wants to.
Yeah.
And I suggested that, well, let's videotape it so we could, and show it on some kind of TV channel late at night, so that if you saw your rich neighbor taking advantage of it, it would be slightly embarrassing.
Yeah.
but in general, the idea would be that people who have plenty of food generally aren't going to try to get extra free food. And for people who are truly hungry, let's just, no questions asked, minimal administrative costs, just pile up the food. And it's kind of a cool idea. But then you start thinking, well, but one of the things that makes markets work so well is this Hayekian solution to the knowledge problem, which is the idea that we don't know what people really want. You pile up a bunch of Cheerios, turns out that's not what they want. The marketplace steers information, the prices send signals, et cetera, et cetera. And yet a lot of people, I think, would assume that the free food would be the right way to help poor people. And you motivate farmers to produce that free food and to bring it by saying, you're helping people who aren't going to go hungry as a result.
Yep. That's a very concrete way of helping people. Well, why is it that so many people are willing to devote so much effort to contributing their time instead of money? Many times, if you see a fundraiser, and I'm an economist.
Yeah, it's enough. It's
and
enough
so
to say.
It's redundant.
Covers it, yeah.
So when someone, my son rows on a crew team, and they're trying to raise money, and they asked if I would come and spend 4 hours working at a booth selling stuff. And I would be one of 4 people at the booth selling stuff. We're probably going to make $300 or $400. You split that 4 ways in 4 hours.
It's 25.
I'm happy to give $100 not to do that.
You bet.
But if you do that, that's not nearly as good as going and spending your time.
Yeah, it's gauche. Well, this gets us. Let's go down this path for a minute because it's so interesting that this idea that you're going to do something for charity, you're going to walk 25 miles or shoot 1,000 baskets. It's a very strange idea because I always thought, well, why not just go do something productive?
Yeah.
Take the money and take the 1,000 hours of basketball shooting or whatever it is. Go take a job and pay people. Take the money and pay cash to the charity. Make a cash donation. Why is it that I've got to go through this stunt, which obviously has some social benefit because otherwise I don't think it would exist? That you go around and you ask people to sponsor you to do something meaningless, and yet people do it. On both sides of the transaction, they shoot the baskets and they give the money.
It has to be meaningless. It's actually important that it be costly and meaningless.
Is it supposed to show, again, I assume it's a signal of love and affection, of commitment to the cause?
Well, the world is about costly signals.
Yeah.
So you're saying, look how much I care because I'm doing something nonsensical. It's important that it be nonsensical.
Yeah, I find that.
If you give your wife a gift certificate, that's not as good as flowers.
No, it's not.
But the flowers are going to wilt and disappear.
And the gift certificate, she gets to choose what she wants, and maybe she didn't want flowers today.
Yeah, what she wants is to smack you upside the head for giving her a gift certificate.
Exactly. That's another, what I like about this conversation so far, and I apologize to the listeners out there, it has a certain chaotic nature to it, but what we're talking about in all these examples is what I think of as a disconnect between sort of the textbook way of looking at incentives and money versus the cultural trappings around all these things. So, gift certificates, there's it's a book out and studies, and I'm forgetting his name right now, you maybe remember, that shows that Christmas is inefficient. And the reason it's inefficient is you give gifts, and that way it would be better to give money because then the person could buy what they like. And only an economist could write a book like that, write a study like that.
He's fundamentally wrong, actually, in every important way.
I think so, but why do you think so?
People disagree. It makes them less happy. We can argue about whether subjectively somehow they're wrong for getting that gift, but I don't think there's any question that having a gift which might not even be precisely what you have purchased is not as good as getting. It is worse. Forgive me, is better than getting money.
Yeah. No, nobody. And I always like the example I always use is you invite me over for dinner and I was going to bring you a bottle of wine. I say, Mike, here's a $20 bill. Get yourself a nice bottle and choose the one you like.
I'm not sure. Do you like red, white? It's hard for me to know.
And this way you can choose. And maybe you don't even want a bottle of wine tonight. Again, you want something else. But it is clearly, it's not what people do. That's your first point, which is evidently that's not what they want. And
given an opportunity, it's never basically what they do.
Although there are gift certificates. There are. But in many cultural settings, they're inappropriate. Wife's birthday would be one. Dinner guest would be another.
Yeah.
Or cash. By gift certificate, I mean basically cash.
Yeah.
It's just generally not done. And there's a reason for it. And it's not, there's some obvious ways to answer why people do it. You could say, a common argument is, well, they don't know what you paid for the bottle of wine, and that way you can, instead of giving them 20, you can only spend 10, which is absurd. I mean, people shop for wine; they know what wine costs in general. That's a bizarre argument. As you can hide.
If you were able to match what they like, it's a much more charming gift, even if it's cheap. So a bottle of wine that's $7, but that I really like. I think he cares about me. This is not a financial transaction. This is a transaction that takes us into a personal relationship. And so having a personal relationship with the charity, the way that charities are able to raise money is to say, here are the things that we're doing with your money. Here's why it matters. Here's the personal connection that over the long term means they're actually going to be able to raise more money. It is self-interested.
Correct.
To be able to portray yourself successfully, actually, it can't be fake, as not caring about money. You can make more money by not caring about money. And the economist's name was Joel Waldfogel.
That's what I thought, but I didn't want to make a mistake, yeah. let's say that again. You can make more money by not caring about money. What do you mean?
Well, the reason that nonprofits are able to raise money from donors is that they're saying we don't care at all about money, and all of it is going to go to the recipients. So the people that you care about, we're going to spend it efficiently, and we ourselves live like monks. Basically, we've taken a monastic vow. Money doesn't matter to us at all. Our doctors are motivated only by the desire to help people. If they can actually cultivate that reputation, they'll get far more money as a result. So it's self-interested from a nonprofit perspective in terms of raising money and providing more services to be able to say, we don't care about money at all. It's all going to go right through us.
Well, you mentioned this as a nonprofit phenomenon, but let me put it back into the profit context and make it a little more confusing. This is a quote from Merck, and I used it in my book, The Invisible Heart. It's a motto that Merck used to have, or at least some kind of inspiration. An executive...
Merck is a drug company?
Yeah, pharmaceuticals. They said, quote, "We try to remember that medicine is for the patient. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. The better we have remembered that, the larger they have been." So, that's the same idea. If you tell people in a for-profit organization, our goal is to make as much money as possible, generally doesn't do very well. If you say our goal is to help people, that's paradoxically the way, as you say, in the nonprofit setting as well, to make the most money.
But it's very difficult to make a credible commitment really to care more about consumers than about profits.
That's right. Some of it
Anybody would say it.
Yeah, some of it is window dressing or flimflammery or something.
Well, so maybe the reason that we see nonprofits is that it's a way of binding themselves to the mast. Even if we really care about profits, we can't make any, and so give us your donations.
Yeah, the problem with that in the modern setting is that nonprofits, again, and now going back to the legal distinction rather than just the economic distinction we've been talking about, the legal distinction, a nonprofit can pay its employees a ton, can have lots of all kinds of goodies for its that are non-monetary for its employees, influence, prestige, et cetera. So it really is kind of unless you do not charge and do not collect any money, that is really a bit of romance rather than the real thing.
But there are rating agencies that give percentages about administrative costs.
That's true.
So there's an information asymmetry, it's true. And just a few years ago, several large, I'm not going to name them, but several large nonprofits had problems with their executives were riding around in limousines and flying on Learjets. But that came out, and the like in any asymmetry like this, sort of lemons problem. The economists call it lemons because you may get you can't tell what quality you're getting, and the whole thing will dry up. If just a few nonprofits are clearly wasting money, they're not doing it on profits, but they're doing it on compensation, then all of the contributions are going to dry up. And so you get rating agencies saying, no, this one sends 90% of your fund, only 10% administrative costs. So there may be some ways of trying to solve the problem.
Absolutely.
But it is interesting that we see for-profits and non-profits in the same industry. Whether it's the same product is debatable, but certainly serving the same, maybe some of the same group of customers.
Yeah, I want to come to that, and then I'm going to shift gears. So hold that as a place thought, and then before we do that, go on to that, I want to say something about gifts. I actually disagree with you that the best gift is the one that you would have wanted anyway. That I find the wine I know you like or the music that you like, because I think that starts to approximate giving of money. I think the best gift is the gift that you didn't know you'd like. So I go out and I find an author or a band or a movie that you've never heard of, but I put enough time into our relationship that I have an idea that you'd like it. Now, sometimes that fails. Sometimes the sweater is the color you actually don't like because it doesn't look good on you. It's not that you never thought of wearing the lime green sweater. It just doesn't. You don't like it. But often I find you a book or a band or a movie or whatever or a piece of art or a vase that you actually do like, you never would have bought it for yourself. And I think that's the kind of gift we ultimately strive for. And I do think it's an important signaling device. It's a way for me to show you that I think about you, not just I'm spending money on you.
I wonder if it's that, or maybe I do know about it, but I would never have bought it for myself because it seemed frivolous or self-indulgent. But when I get it, I say, "Oh, I'm so glad to have it. I just love this."
That's the other paradox, which is, according to the Waldfogel analysis, if I buy, and again, this is to me the textbook economist analysis, which I think is wrong. So let's say there's a Mike, your favorite baseball team is the St. Louis Cardinals, if I'm not mistaken.
In fact, I just got a Chicago Cubs doormat to put under my desk.
Oh, I got to get one of those for my kids who like the Cardinals. I have two kids who like the Cardinals, two Red Sox fans. But so I know Mike likes the Cardinals, and let's say, who's your favorite Cardinals player, Mike?
Well, I like I like Albert Pujols, but I like one that's probably going to upset you. He scored
Enos Slaughter.
From first in the 1946 World Series. I have a signed picture of Enos Slaughter, but it isn't a very good one. I'd like a much better one.
Okay, so let's suppose you have this pretty good one, and I'm so nice. Mike's making a reference to the fact that Enos Slaughter scored a winning run in the 1946 World Series that meant that my Red Sox lost and his Cardinals won. Neither of us were born, but it's interesting we still care about it. I'm such a good friend to you, Mike, that I'm going to get you an piece of Enos Slaughter memorabilia that you would not buy for yourself.
It's $300, and there's no way I would pay that much.
It's not worth it to you. You would rather have $300 than this frame photograph signed by Enos Slaughter that's really beautiful. And I go buy it for you. Now, I don't think anybody who gets that gift says the following: "Gosh, I wish I'd gotten the money, because then I could have had $300 and bought something I like even more than this."
Yeah, I don't think. Not only do they not say it, they don't think it.
They don't. Nobody even. Only an economist thinks it, and not for very long.
And that's what Waldfogel says. He says that on average it's 16%. You would pay 16% less, and that's why Christmas is no good. And elderly people, it's probably more like 40%. What you get from your grandma, you would pay at least 40% less than what she paid for it, and she's better off giving you cash, and that's wrong. I am so happy to have that Enos Slaughter photograph.
And part of it is, and here's the irony, and this is where the standard textbook model breaks down. I think the reason you want to have it is you like it. You like it, but not $300 worth. And it could be a lot of reasons you don't like it for $300. It could be your wife's. This is an easy one. If your wife would be upset that you bought it and I buy it for you, you're thrilled. But that's not the case I'm talking about. I'm talking about the case where you just think, I quote, can't, I shouldn't get it. It's not worth it. But now you get all the benefits of looking at the picture every day, and there are no.
Well, if I bought it for myself, it would be self-indulgent. That's the sort of thing that only someone who just loves themselves. But as a gift, well, it's a sign of your esteem.
Correct. So Mike, just send me the catalog number, and I'll send you a check, and you can buy it for yourself. Okay? So that's what's great about, and that illustrates to me really how that would really, I think, offend you. But if it showed up on your doorstep where you could step on the Cubs mat as you pulled it in from the UPS driver, you'd be ecstatic.
Yep.
I want to go back to the hospital case, and then I want to totally shift gears. Do you remember what you were saying about hospitals right before I went back to gifts? You were saying that they coexist.
That the different ways of providing the service coexist, and apparently I started to say in equilibrium. It seems pretty stable. It's not that one's disappearing. Both are expanding at about the same rate, and there seem to be some advantages of nonprofits, partly because of what we've talked about. It's a way of inducing people to give more contributions, but also genuinely out of the fact that people like the idea of providing this service for free, or at least at a reduced cost, to people who need it.
Yeah, but I think the hospital thing is a little bit of a red herring, because I think most nonprofit hospitals charge for their services. It's true they have an indigent part, but so do for-profit hospitals. I think the hospital thing really is it confuses what's fundamentally going on, and that's why I suggested that we should think about a model that was what I would call a real nonprofit. They collect nothing. It's just there's no fee for service, and the people who donate to cover the cost of the hospital do so because they care about the mission of the hospital. And we don't see that for obvious reasons. The reason we don't see it, as a side note, I should mention it. Government provision of these things has crowded out all of the private, truly nonprofit ways that these would be provided. The expansion of government in the early 1930s at the federal level basically eliminated private charity to help the indigent, help the hungry, help the sick who are poor. What most private charity goes to today, almost all of it, very, very little of it goes to the indigent. It's been crowded out. You will see a soup kitchen for homeless people because they can't manage to get food stamps. They don't have an address. They don't want to fill out a form. They're not integrated into normal bureaucracy. So you can still collect money to fund a food bank or a soup kitchen for homeless people. It's very hard to compete with food stamps, say, via the general poor people via private charity.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to.
Where do we see nonprofits? I guess I'm a more cynical. You're a nice guy.
Yeah.
I'm more cynical than you. I mostly see nonprofits to provide subsidized services to rich people. I see nonprofits for museums, art museums, the opera, and what they're doing is taking advantage of the tax-exempt status of this to subsidize services to themselves and claim credit at their big gala for being a contributor to their social class, to the people that say, look at us, we're contributing to the opera.
Yeah, no, that is and of course they have some window dressing around it to try to make it look like, they'll have some programs for inner city schools, or they'll bring the opera company in to sing the Marriage of Figaro. But the fact is overwhelmingly the tax status of those institutions are helping rich people, which is bizarre.
It is somewhat different from the original rationale.
Yeah, that's the right way to say it. Not bizarre. It's perfectly normal.
But perverse.
Yeah, if you pretend it's something else.
Yeah.
And that would be true of education as well, right? The nonprofit status of universities overwhelmingly helps rich people who go to universities. But, of course, there are a lot of increasingly middle and poor, lower-income people who go to university, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, sure.
But it is now I want to get to the I'm going to make one stop along the way. The reason I've been thinking about some of these issues is I had a guest on last week, Art Devaney, 2 weeks ago. And Art has some interesting and provocative theories about nutrition and diet. And he has a website, and that website used to be free, and now it's not. There's some free parts to it, but if you want to get to the good stuff, you got to pay a subscription fee. He charges for the service. And some of the commenters to that podcast were offended by that. And they thought, here he is promoting his website on this podcast. And I had a couple of thoughts on that. One is, well, that's what we all do. We're all selling something. Sometimes it's just our reputation or our brand name to try to get money elsewhere. But that's not uncommon. An author wants to sell a book. We have lots of authors on here. Nobody complains. It's interesting. Nobody complains and says, oh, he's just talking about his book because he wants to sell copies. It's true, you don't make a lot of money selling books generally, but we're all selling books. We're all doing other things to help bring money in. We call it capitalism. It's nothing shameful about it. If you don't like it, don't go to his site. Don't pay for it. That's the way the world works. But I think there's some hostility to this, partly because, and I don't want to overdo this, and let's get your reaction, partly because we have a lot of free stuff available to us. And I wonder if we're getting a sense of entitlement. So Cafe Hayek, where I blog, you blog at Kids Prefer Cheese. We don't charge. It's free. I kind of like it that way. I don't have to post every day. I just took a week or two off. I'm trying to finish a paper. I'm busy. I don't feel any guilt about it. I feel a little bit of guilt, actually, to my co-blogger and a little bit to the readers. But in general, you're not paying anything to read my stuff there. And so if I want to take a break, that seems okay. But I don't do that at George Mason. George Mason pays my salary, and it could be we could have a different model. People could say, how dare somebody try to make money teaching and helping other people understand how the world works via economics? And we could have some donations. We could have other ways of doing it, but we don't. We have something in between profit and we have a nonprofit legally, and it's certainly there's a big disconnect between my students, how much they pay per.
But you keep writing stuff, trying to get a higher salary. You're a pig.
Yeah, I am. That's right. I'm greedy. I don't like that word. I'm interested in money. I want.
You are interested in having your salary increased, and you do those things that are somewhat likely, at least, to make them say, this is a really valuable guy. Yeah, we're going to pay him more.
Give him a good raise. I want to.
A lot of those things are in public. You're doing things publicly that appeal to an audience where you can say, look at this thing that I've done.
And now let me segue to the media. So right now there's this obvious problem that newspapers have that they're not making much money. Their old source of revenue was advertising. That advertising has been stripped away by Craigslist and other internet features that make it hard to charge people for that information. And I would argue that newspapers and Art Devaney's website and EconTalk and Cafe Hayek all have something really important in common, which is that it's very inexpensive to expand the audience by one member. So there's a certain really attractive thing about the fact that they're really cheap and that the costs are covered by people other than the customers. So in the case of newspapers, it used to be advertisers who were willing to pay to get their ads in front of those eyeballs. Now that they're having trouble doing that, they're going to have trouble collecting the money. But of course, they could become charities. The New York Times could create a foundation, not charge for the New York Times, give it away for free, which it does on the web, and lots of news organizations do now, almost all, except the Wall Street Journal is the only really prominent one that doesn't.
Yeah.
Couldn't they just create a great newspaper using the model of, say, National Public Radio, which, although it gets tax money, we could imagine a world where they didn't get any tax money. It was all funded.
It's a fairly small amount.
It's relatively small. It could be funded by donations. And wouldn't that be an okay world?
Isn't it a paradox to say they can't make money by demanding it, but they could finance themselves better by stop charging subscriptions and asking for voluntary donations? That's the opposite of the way we think about Samuelson's story of public goods. The problem is markets can't charge for public goods. This is an excludable private good. All I have to have is a password. But I think you're right, Russ. I think that big newspapers that are going to survive, are not going to be able to say, here's a password we're excluding, which is very easy to do. You've got to sign in order to look at our content. They're going to make the content free and then ask for donations to make it possible to continue this. And presumably the reason is some relatively smaller number of people are going to donate proportionally more.
Yes, they will.
Than a few of us paying $1 a week.
Yeah, and
it seems like a paradox. It's the opposite of the usual story about public goods.
And I think it's an interesting, viable model. And again, I want to come back to what I think are some of the problems with it, but we think of it as a viable model. The reason it's viable is that besides the fact that people have nostalgia for a brand name like the New York Times, others have negative nostalgia, of course, but there are many people who have positive nostalgia for it, and they want to, quote, curl up with their Sunday New York Times puzzle, either on their iPad or eventually or on their holding it in their hand in the Sunday magazine. And so foundations and others, and individuals, but mostly will be foundations, as you say, or very wealthy people will fund these out of love. And the fact that this is the punchline of this part, the fact that it's being distributed at zero marginal cost, that is, that there's no subscription, there's no fee, will allow people to collect more donations because they'll say, look, we can't fund this by charging for it. We're gonna raise money by we're going to beg, but the donor is going to say, but I'm going to reach a lot of people with that high quality because the marginal cost to the consumer, not the marginal, it's the wrong way to say it, the out-of-pocket cost to the consumer is zero. Which brings me to the question then of that business model. Is that a better model than maybe the only viable one, but is the outcome attractive relative to one where there's not this disconnect between who pays for it and who consumes it? See, normally in economics we say, and I certainly believe this in medical care, and I probably believe it in education. I said so last week in the Diane Ravitch podcast. I said people, one of the problems with the public school system is we give it away. We don't charge for it, so people don't treat it as something of value as they would if they had to work to earn the money to pay for it. And I think that's part of the problem with our school system. Yeah. And yet, here we're talking about a situation where, and I'm going to again use EconTalk as an example, I want lots of listeners. Not because, I'll get more money from Liberty Fund, but because that's what I'm in the business for. I'm trying to encourage, I like the money part, sure. But the real goal here is to encourage economic education. And I want to have a huge audience of highly interested listeners. Will I get as good an audience if they don't have to pay for it? Yeah. And I think I will. I think it'll be just as good. I don't think there's going to be an incentive problem there. I don't know. What do you think?
If the comparison you're making to have it behind but this all suggests a question. I think the question that you asked is a very interesting one. It does seem like you'll get as good an audience. Before I asked, is there something different about healthcare? Is there something different about the internet? I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. I get the paper version. I don't mind paying it. For some reason, it just infuriated me to think I was going to have to pay.
Isn't that weird? Yeah.
To get access to the New York Times. It makes no sense. Is there something about the internet where we think it should be free? And are we going to get over that? Are there going to be? Is it going to be possible to charge subscriptions? I don't mind paying for software even. So it isn't even everything on my computer. It's just what's on the internet. Why is it? And maybe the listeners can help. They'd be interested in people's comments. Why is it that we want stuff to be free on the internet to such an extent that we'll actually harm ourselves? The New York Times was about $1 a week when they were charging. I would have paid that. I would have been better off having access and giving up $1, for heaven's sakes.
But it made you mad.
But I made myself worse off by having some sort of bizarre principled, and this is bizarre, what I saw as a principled thing. No, it should be free. Why? Why should they provide this service for free? And yet I, of all people, and I'm not big on the whole people should do stuff for free, I fell into that trap.
Part of it, I think, is a feeling of entitlement because that's the way that's the way it's always been. There's a famous story. Can't believe you and I have never talked about this on the air, but I don't think we have. There are a lot of people over the age of 70, I think 70 is about the cutoff now, maybe it's 80, who hate the Red Cross. Do you know this? Do you know this story?
I do not.
Okay, they hate the Red Cross. And I first encountered this, I used to do some work with charities and nonprofits through the business school at Washington University, and I'd be talking to some charity or to some group of individuals, and then I always say, well, that'll be okay as long as we don't have the Red Cross involved. And I thought, usually the Red Cross, I would think it'd be kind of a positive vibe organization. Most people would feel warmly toward the Red Cross.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it turns out there's a significant group of people, it's diminishing over time, but there's a significant group of people who have a visceral, angry, negative reaction to the Red Cross. Why? And the answer is, this is unbelievable. In World War II, the Red Cross and other national organizations that help with sick and wounded people used to give away donuts. This is not a joke. This is not an urban...
You're making this up.
No, and it's not an urban legend. They used to give away donuts to soldiers and whoever it was. And at some point during the war, they started charging for the donuts.
I could see it coming, but I didn't believe it.
And it was a nickel, I think, was the amount. And I've even heard people in the Red Cross today say when they encounter this and it's always, from veterans or veterans' families, sometimes they'll come to a meeting and they'll bring a box of donuts and they'll say, look, or 2 boxes, or gross, and they'll say, here's a bunch of free donuts, let's just not talk about the donut thing, okay? This makes up for all the donuts we charged, the 17 donuts that we made you pay a nickel for. But so that argument, and I don't know I think this is a true story, I'm sure we'll get some comments, but I've heard it, I'm a skeptical person, it sounds like a fake story, but I've seen it in person, I've seen people complain about it, and I've heard Red Cross people talk about it in frustration. They took something they'd been giving away, and they said, well, gee, we're losing a lot of money on this. And of course, in the case of donuts, unlike the internet, the more people as you lower the price, you get more people and your costs go way, way, way up because each donut costs 8 cents or 3 cents or whatever it is. So in that case, they were so angry at having to pay for something they were given, even though they're real costs. It wasn't like they were profiting off the soldiers. I assume maybe they're charging.
I have to admit, I just looked this up on Snopes, and the Snopes claim, apparently after investigating it, was that the U.S. Army asked the Red Cross to charge for coffee, donuts, and lodging. So it wasn't trying to make a profit; it was trying to break even. And the Army was worried about having to provide a subsidy because people valued this service. So
it's a true story that they did.
In spite of my skepticism, Snopes they have quotes here from Eisenhower, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, directly about this issue. This is so I was wrong. It's not just the internet. It turns out it's internet and donuts.
Yeah, it turns. So.
If you got it for free and then they start charging, what's wrong? We had a contract, even though there's no contract at all.
And of course, it's not even true for many, many other things that it could be true for, right? If I have a new product and I want to get you to try it and I give you a free sample, you don't come back 2 weeks later and say, hey, it was free before, I'm not paying for it. Well, understand that some things are given away for free to get people interested. But I do think there's a sense of entitlement. I think psychologically it's very hard to pay for something you used to get for nothing. There's probably a thousand other things going on here, but I do think it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And I think it's going to be hard to go back to a podcast we also did recently with Steve Mayer that for people who have stolen their music for many years, they're going to have trouble paying for it emotionally.
Yeah. And the fact is, what that means is, and this is the thing that's amazing to me, and I do it myself, that means they will forego transactions, the value of which would be less than the money that they would have to pay. It's irrational, and yet they will persist out of this sense that it's wrong.
Yeah. Of course, if it disappears, if news organizations disappeared and one came along with had a subscription fee, I don't know if that would change things.
If we're right, it would have to be generational. So that there are organizations that sell music at 99 cents a song. There's a song I really like. I say I want that, but I have to pay 99 cents. I'm not going to do it. It should be free. Well, 99 cents is not enough to worry about, but I'm going to forego this transaction and not be able to listen to a song that I like because I have this principle that it should be free.
Or you're going to steal it elsewhere.
Well, I'm going to spend $4 worth of my time stealing it because it should be free. Yes. So if I spend 2 hours stealing it, I should have paid the 99 cents. It's not free.
Yeah, it's a. I'm not sure I understand. Well, I know I don't understand this. It's just something to think about. I do think that the evolution of information is going to take some unexpected twists and turns over the next 5 to 10 years as organizations try to cope with the fact that their resources are shrinking and they have to find alternatives or they're going to disappear.
Well, let me ask that question. Would it be okay? You posed a conjecture that might actually be right. The reason I didn't want to pay the New York Times is it's a for-profit company. If it becomes a nonprofit, would it make it easier for me mentally to pay a subscription fee? So maybe that is the business model that'll work. You set up a nonprofit. We're only covering our costs here. We're going to do our best. And it's a fee-for-service nonprofit. It's not a donation nonprofit. Maybe I might be more willing to pay if it's new. So the nonprofit, the New York Times as it exists, disappears. A new one, which is nonprofit, but charges for subscriptions might be more viable. I'm not sure that's true because that's not the argument you made. You said it'd be easier for them to get contributions, and that's clearly right. But I might even be more willing to make a subscription, a fee-for-service arrangement, if it's a nonprofit. That really would be perverse if that's true.
And the other area, to bring us full circle back to the medical issue, back in the 50s, I think it was the 50s, it was considered grotesque that people would get paid for giving blood. And economists weighed in on this. There was a book by Richard Titmuss called The Gift Relationship, which I confess I've never read, or if I have, I've forgotten about it. I probably tried to read it or took it out of the library a long time ago. I wrote a piece on this ages ago with Michael Wolkoff for the New York Times on the incentives of this. And it's such a weird thing, right? Do you want people to donate blood for money, or do you want them to donate blood out of love? Well, if you haven't donated out of love, and the same is true for kidneys, and we had Alex Tabarrok talk about it here before, you don't get very many.
No, I want them to donate it out of love, but they don't do it.
Well, it's really painful, obviously, and hard to do. I don't know. It's I just wonder. What I find fascinating is that our cultural attitudes towards these things have ebbed and flowed.
Well, your point is a good one. The question is, suppose you had two companies. One's a for-profit company that sells blood. The other is a non-profit company that gives away blood to people who need it. Which one is more likely to make you go in and roll up your sleeve? And how much would the for-profit company have to pay you for blood? Probably quite a lot, whereas the Red Cross and others get people to donate blood for free because they're not making money on it. So there, the for-profit has an advantage. The non-profit has an advantage.
But the argument at the time, and I think still is the argument, although it's probably changed, I haven't looked at it in a long time, the argument at the time was if you pay people for the blood, you get people who desperately need money. They're more likely to be drug addicts. They're people with health problems.
And they may give too often because they can lie about that.
They can lie. They've got hepatitis. They've got AIDS. But technology, I assume, has improved that problem. It's a very interesting, and again, the two could coexist. You could have places where people collected blood gave it as volunteers, others where they gave for money. If I remember correctly, plasma still has or at least did have a commercial market. You donated plasma for money.
Yeah.
I assume it's because it's harder and less pleasant to donate, and they just couldn't get enough of it if they asked for volunteers. I don't know. Anyway, the fundamental question, which I started with, and we'll close with this, is as economists, we tend to argue for the power of profit and monetary incentives. We understand that there are lots of other motivations that affect people, but I think the world's a little more complicated than we sometimes think, and the role that money plays. I know it's more complicated than economists sometimes think, and the role that culture plays, the role our expectations play, and the role that non-monetary forces play in trying to get around incentive failures, motivation, is also a large part of the story.
And earlier you mentioned Hayek, and you said the Hayekian argument about markets as providing information. And Hayek, of course, did make that argument in the 1945 American Economic Review article. But later in life, Hayek made arguments about forms of organization that might not really look like traditional markets, that might have cultural variants that could be nonprofits. And the way to figure out whether they're going to work is to see whether they survive and are able to provide these services and are able to attract donations or enough revenue to be able to operate. So in a way, there's an interesting Hayekian view about nonprofits also that I think would be interesting for someone to research and do more work on, because his concern was largely it's going to be hard for governments to do this. But later in life, especially in his later works, he wrote about the wide variety of different voluntary private organizations that might be able to do this. And you can't tell in advance. No one has enough information. We, the scholars, the economists, can't say, well, markets have to do this. It may be some kind of voluntary private organization that solves the donation problem, or the sense that people want to provide their resources and their time to nonprofit organizations instead of strictly for-profit market institutions. I think that's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, and how those institutions would emerge, what form they would take, whether they would mix in some profit or revenue-generating activity. It's let a thousand flowers bloom is probably the right answer. But I find it, and of course the other area we haven't talked about is software, Wikipedia, open source software where people are contributing their time without direct compensation. They may get some reputational advantages, of course. But there's a lot of things people are doing these days, not for money, that they do out of love, and it works pretty well.
Yes.
My guest today has been Mike Munger. Mike, as always, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It was a pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.